Little story time. Grand Bahama Island, 1969, my first dive of Bahamian adventure. In the summer of 1969, I and a couple of fraternity brothers took part in a leadership development conference in the Bahamas. We took a day cruise over to Freeport. Although the skies were clear and the waters were very rough. When the lunch was served, we headed to the galley. I have no idea why anyone would think serving lasagna while the ship was violently rolling side to side and up and down was a good idea, but apparently they did. It didn't bother me, but my brothers did not fare as well. We got on the ship about 9 a.m. and they slammed beer all morning. About 2 bites into the pasta, they looked at each other, turned gray, and immediately jumped up, hand over mouth, and ran for the deck. There I found them with about 30 of their fellows hanging over the deck railing, spewing lasagna volcanically into the aquamarine seas. It was pretty impressive and the high point of the 55-mile cruise over to the port. When we arrived in Freeport, a bus waited to take us to the Jack Tar Resort, located in West End. The 26-mile trip from Freeport to West End took about an hour in an unair-conditioned bus. Needless to say, my companions were still not looking too good when we arrived, and they dashed to their rooms to collapse after checking in. I was feeling fine and decided to check the place out. I'd never seen anything quite like it. The Jack Tar Village was the very first and largest all-inclusive resort in the Caribbean. The resort opened in 1960 and was lavish. The private beach stretching for miles was breathtaking with brilliant white sand and palm trees and clear turquoise water. I had been to the beach as a kid, but I had never seen water like this. As I walked along the beach, my bare feet sinking into the soft, powdery sand, I saw a guy I figured was probably one of the conference participants. I said hello and we introduced ourselves. His name was Danny and he was a junior at the University of Wyoming. I asked what he thought about the place and he said he had already been there a couple of days and he liked it a lot. It was quite clear that he had been there for at least a while because his highly freckled 6-foot frame, topped by an unruly shock of curly red hair, was pretty much burned to a crisp. He told me he had his scuba diving certification and he wanted to go diving and had been looking for a dive partner. He asked if I was certified and I answered no, but I was extremely interested in trying it. He said it was easy. All you had to do was remember to always keep breathing, never hold your breath, come up slower than your exhaust bubbles, and when the tank got hard to pull, it was time to start back up. I asked what he meant by hard to pull, and he said the tanks were fitted with a spring-loaded reserve valve, which closed off the supply of air once the tank reached 500 psi. This served as an abrupt warning that the tank was about empty and you needed to end the dive. I said, well, that all sounded fine to me, and we agreed to meet at the resort dive shop the following morning. In 1965, the famous Underwater Explorer Society established a small outpost and dive shop in the resort complex. We arrived at their shop at about 8:30 in the morning. Danny rented the equipment and gave them his certification card to hold for security. I was quite surprised, but they didn't even ask us any questions. As we got to the beach, we put everything in a couple of totes, and Danny asked the operator where we could go to shore dive a coral reef. He looked up and pointed to this open sea. We looked at him questioningly, and he said there was a shallow reef about 30 feet of water, 200 to 300 yards offshore. As we walked out of the hut, he warned us to be careful and not get too tired because the tide was running out to sea. When we got to the shore, we assembled our equipment. Danny suggested that to conserve air, we should swim on the surface using our snorkels until we reached the reef. That seemed reasonable, and we waded into the ocean to about waist deep to put on our flippers. I had never worn flippers before, and every time I raised my foot off the bottom, the wave action would knock me down. It was a real comedy, and I was already tiring. Finally, Danny suggested I breathe through my snorkel and just float with the waves as I put my flippers on. Well, that worked, and we began to swim out toward the reef. The light reflected off the white sand bottom, and except for occasional patches of turtle grass, there was very little life present. The outflowing current was not strong, but with its aid, we rapidly covered the distance to the reef. When we began our dive, suddenly before us was the palette of a master painter, a panorama of every color in nature's bounty. The coral was enchantingly beautiful, pulsing with the richness of life. Every imaginable species of fish seemed to be present. Reef barracudas made occasional sprints after passing minnows. A small sea turtle nibbled along the edge of the reef. 2 giant brain corals were immediately below. Fan corals were waving in the current. A stingray was moving gracefully through the water. The reef was teeming with life, and the intense beauty of it all took my breath. I knew immediately I could never let this go. Suddenly, as we hung suspended in the water, transfixed by the magical vision before us, we were surrounded from behind by a huge school of Spanish mackerel. Dozens, if not hundreds, of fish, each about 12 inches long, immersed us in a brilliant sea of silver. The fish were so close I could not focus my eyes, and soon found myself both amazed and disoriented at the same time. As the school dissipated, we saw a big torpedo-shaped silver-colored fish coming toward us in a leisurely pursuit of the departing mackerel school. When the fish spotted us, it came to a sudden halt, hanging in the water about 10 feet away. As the fish continued its pause, I looked at Danny, shrugging my shoulders and turning my palms up in a what gives gesture. He shook his head no. Since neither of us knew the diving hand signal conventions, we engaged in a pantomime worthy of a Charlie Chaplin silent movie. Finally, we determined that we should go up to the surface for a consultation. We slowly ascended, keeping a vigilant eye on the fish who began to swim in lazy circles around us. This was not helping our emotional stability. When we reached the surface and pulled out our mouthpieces so we could talk, well, our attempt at communication was less than effective. As soon as one of us began to talk, the other one would duck back under to check on the fish. Our heads were bobbing up and down like a pigeon eating popcorn on the sidewalk. After several minutes of the fish slowly circling our position, we finally agreed that heading towards shore was the better part of valor. We started swimming side by side toward the shore, breathing through our snorkels. The fish decided to continue circling us, each time ending up directly facing us. We would then tack to the left or to the right, losing sight of the fish before it suddenly reappeared in front of us, and we were forced to repeat the process. Now the tidal currents were running against us, and the swimming to and fro was increasing the distance. This, combined with our hyperactive adrenaline rush, was rapidly exhausting our energy. My heart was pounding. As I swam, I realized the fish had come up on my left, immediately beside me. Each time it opened its mouth, all I could see were hundreds of needle-like teeth. The fish was so close I could not take a full stroke without hitting it. Danny was on my right, and I immediately ducked under him. Thus we began a panicked leapfrog contest to see who could duck the quickest under the other one to get away from the fish. This lasted a while until I could no longer see the fish, and thinking that the fish had probably lost interest and abandoned its pursuit, I began to breathe a little easier. That is, until I happened to look back and realize the fish was right behind me, less than a foot from the end of my flippers. Well, that was it. Full-on panic. I began to wildly kick and swim in a total desperation for the shore. Suddenly it occurred to me, what happens if I kick this fish in the nose? Instantly I came to a full stop. The fish took my sudden halt in stride, ducked below me, and swam slowly the length of my body. I watched as every inch of that fish passed no more than 6 inches below my nose. By then we were in shallow water within reach of the shore. Any composure I may have had completely evaporated. I jerked my flippers off and ran through the shallow water over the jagged limestone to the shore. As if the rocks were not bad enough, we both at once ran through a big patch of coastal sandburr, armored with stiff, very sharp needles, which themselves were mantled with minute, backward-pointing spines. When they punctured your skin because of those backward-pointing spines, pulling them out became a most miserable experience. There's simply no nice way of getting unstuck. We spent about 30 minutes picking the needles out of our feet and talking about the experience with the fish. Danny said he didn't think it was a shark, and I just shook my head and agreed and said it was some kind of barracuda, but a whole lot bigger than the ones on the reef. As we talked, I realized that despite being certified to scuba dive, he had little more knowledge than I did. It turned out the sum total of his diving experience was 4 one-hour checkout dives over 2 days in a Wyoming rock quarry. I could only shake my head, recognizing that I clearly had a massive failure of due diligence on my hands. We leapt back to the shop. When we arrived, the operator took one look and asked what happened. We recounted our fish adventure, and he began to laugh uncontrollably, holding on the counter to keep from falling down. Finally, gasping for breath, he told us it was a king barracuda, and they were relatively rare in the Bahamas and mostly harmless. He asked how large it was, and I answered that when it swam under my nose, it seemed to be just about 10 feet long. He snorted with laughter again and said he doubted it. One over 4.5 feet was quite rare and a really big fish. The reef barracudas were about 30 inches max, and I said this fish was close to double that length. He nodded and said the fish was probably just a little curious and being a bit playful. The only real danger was they were attracted to shiny objects, and it could have accidentally bitten one of us and it struck the stainless steel rings on our equipment. Well, I'm glad to say that ended my first Bahamian live dive adventure. Thank you.